Alberta. So for those of you who have not joined us before, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization with the mission to elevate public engagement with underreported issues. While we're based in Washington, D.C., our staff and our work are global. We support more than 170 reporting projects each year in collaboration with news outlets around the world on issues like environment, racial justice, migration, public health, and more. And we don't stop with the reporting. Our education programming spans from elementary schools to graduate degree programs and outreach to the broader public. We're so glad that you're joining us this year for our first ever virtual conference, Environment Redefined, our 4th annual conference. In past years, we've explored topics of gender, peace, and conflict and religion. And last year, in lieu of a conference canceled because of the state of the world and the pandemic, we hosted an online series focused on justice issues. And if you're inspired by what you hear today, please consider supporting our vital mission. So we'll get to it in a second, but briefly, logistics. Today, we will be talking about media and stereotypes of Indigenous communities related to the environment. I'll tell the folks listening more about what that means in a moment. But we'll begin with a conversation among the panelists, then aim to answer questions from the audience. You can do that anytime via the Q&A icon. Please note that all attendees are muted, but if you can't hear us, let us know via the chat box. We are recording this session to post online, and we're also live tweeting, and you can join that conversation with the hashtag #EnvironmentRedefined. And one final note, please stay online once this session ends to participate in a brief survey. Now, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. We have Edilma Prada Céspedes, who is the founder and director of Agenda Propia. We have Tristan Ahtone, the editor-in-chief of the Texas Observer. Amanda Tachine, the assistant professor in education leadership and innovation at Arizona State University. We have Qannik Glenn, host and producer of Coffee and Quaq. Thank you all for being here. Would you folks like to introduce yourselves as well?
Sure, I'll go first. Hi, everybody. Uvla loatak. Good morning. Uvanga Qannik. My name is Qannik Glenn. Qannik is my Inupiaq name. Inupiaq gurunga ut kerving mi gurunga. I'm Inupiaq, Alaska Native Inupiaq from the northern part of Alaska. My hometown is Utqiagvik, and it is the northernmost city in the United States. It's some 700 miles north of where I am now, currently on Dena'ina Athabascan land in Anchorage, and it's about 320 miles above the Arctic Circle. Angayokakak Richard Lou, Arlene Lou Glenn. My parents are Richard Savik and Arlene Ichlin Glenn of Utqiagvik. And Savaktunga Kupiar Luquar Lumi. I now work full-time on my podcast and projects associated with my podcast titled Coffee and Quaq. Quaq is the Inupiaq word for frozen or raw meat or fish. So I like to say coffee to keep us woke, and then Quaq to represent examining our topics through an Alaska Native lens. Historically and contemporarily, my people were and are seasonal nomadic. So although I say I'm from Utqiagvik, our people were forced into hub cities during the missionization and colonization of Alaska. So folks were kind of forced to move into hub cities to go to school, to attend church. But our people are, very much travelers. And so although I am from Utqiagvik, I'm also from everywhere north of the Brooks Range. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to hear from all of you panelists, and thank you.
I can go next. Yate. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. She'eya Amanda Tachine Yanisha. Nanish Eja Tachine Nishlong as a Sana Bashichin, Trabaha Dashiche Ado, Ashia Dashanale, Look Antia Nasha, Kotego Ea Zanishle. I am Amanda Tachine, and I introduce myself to you in Navajo, which identifies my clan relatives, which is how we are always raised to introduce ourselves, acknowledge kinship relationships, my relationships to the land. I'm from Locantia, which means the patch of wide reeds in Ganado, Arizona. And what's beautiful about our introduction that I'm learning more about is the last thing is we say is which means that's how I identify myself as a Dene woman, which really is situating my positionality as a woman, because we come from matrilineal communities, which speaks volumes considering we're in a patriarchal nation state. There are matrilineal families thriving and have since time immemorial. I'm so delighted to be a part of this conversation. I work currently on the beautiful lands of the Acoma Ahtone and Pequash peoples in Phoenix, Arizona, at Arizona State University, where I actually study Indigenous students and systems and structures that disenfranchise them. And I'm just really honored to learn from everybody on this panel today and look forward to the discussion. Ahiha.
Bueno, bien, me presento yo.
So let me introduce myself. Hello, everyone. My name is Edilma Prada. I am a journalist and I run Agenda Propia, independent media. My greetings from Colombia. Agenda Propia is an independent media that has been created, and we have indigenous and non-indigenous journalists to tell about the reality of Colombia and the indigenous people in Latin America. And Agenda Propia, we promote independent journalism and collaboration and intercultural journalism. We have a group we promote at a level of Latin America. It is called the Red Knitting Stories. We are indigenous and non-indigenous journalists to getting ready and wondering how to cover better indigenous issues related to the land and the environment, but also we think internally how to write better and tell better about the indigenous people. I am in the Amazons in Colombia, in Florencia city. From here, we promote different kinds, especially research journalism. I believe at this moment to cover indigenous topics, issues in Latin America and in the Amazons, in Indian regions, it requires more research journalism. That is why we promote research journalism. And also, we do that journalism respecting the proper storytelling of the indigenous peoples.
And hi, my name is Tristan Ahtone. I'm the editor-in-chief at the Texas Observer. I'm Kiowa. I'm a professor of journalism at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Typically, I am based in Austin, Texas, which would be the sort of eastern edge of Kiowa raiding and hunting territories. But today, I'm joining you from Tewa land in San Fe, New Mexico.
Awesome. Situ Osmalsi, thank you all for introducing yourselves. Si Sinaan mo Leilani Rania Ganser, Guahusi Familia and JJ Don Romeo. I'm Leilani. I am from the JJ and Romeo clans of the Chamorro people. And I'm Maka Ainana Kanaka Maoli. I'm one of the common people of Hawaii. So a little bit more about what this panel is. I hope that you're not here for an Indigenous solution to environmental problems, because that is not what I will be offering. And I don't think what the panelists will be offering necessarily either. This panel is a lot more about a common stereotype, primarily in the US, of what's called the Ecological Indian. Now, while it's true that Indigenous people comprising about 5% of the global population are protecting about 80% of the land on Earth. But some of the issues with this stereotype are the ways that it ignores the base of environmentalism, as well as the complex relationship of Indigenous peoples to land. I can give you one quick example of each. If you were here earlier this week with our conversation with Reverend Lennox Yearwood, we talked about who the environmental movement comprises. A very easy example of that is the Sierra Club's contribution to eugenics and white supremacy under the guise of environmentalism. This also ignores, like I said, the complex relationship of Indigenous people to land. So another example of that is a common anti-science portrayal of Kanaka Maoli, Indigenous Hawaiians protesting against what's called the 30-meter telescope, which we might touch on a little bit more. But I really wanted to start off with a question about what Indigenous journalism is and whether or not it's different from Western journalism. The News Leaders Association and RTDNA report that according to surveys in the US, less than 1% of journalists are Native American. So does that mean there are no Indigenous journalists? I'm going to start with Edilma to answer that question. Edilma, could you talk more about Indigenous storytelling in Western journalism?
Gracias.
Thank you. I believe I am a traditional journalist. I'm going to be 20 years exercising journalism in Colombia and some places in Latin America. I have developed a work related to indigenous peoples, armed conflict, and human rights. I believe that when I approach the indigenous territories, I believe journalism has the same characteristics. To do journalism, any issue has the same characteristics. Nevertheless, covering indigenous topics or issues implies that the journalist develops several sensitiveness, feelings. Second, to prepare, to have previous knowledge about the indigenous peoples, and cover each indigenous people requires to know, for example, their own cosmovision, culture, the reality. In Agenda Propia, for example, we have developed an approach and precisely a demand that we have developed is to add in our stories more context. At the moment, the stories that journalists write, the ones who are not indigenous, they lack historical context, they lack cosmogonic context, and they lack the context of the actual reality, the current reality. So that is a Western journalism. We need more knowledge about the indigenous peoples. And the second, as a goal, is to walk a little more the territories. The stories told about the indigenous people in mostly the journalists don't know, not even, they haven't even gone there to the indigenous communities. So it is important to walk the territories whenever possible. At the moment, due to the COVID, it is not possible, but we need to develop other strategies, as for example, to involve in our exercise more voices of the indigenous peoples. Journalism covers indigenous stories with only one voice, and that voice generally is official, not from the indigenous people. So I believe the journalism, we must add more indigenous voices in our stories, because that is not happening. I believe the efforts like Ana Propia is doing, just to use an example I leader in Latin America, is to invite journalism to add more context to the indigenous people, to add more voices from communities, from grandmothers, children, young people, healers, and we need to walk more the communities. If we cannot go, then let us look for indigenous spokespeople in the territories, and through them we know more. I would add a last one. It is we lack also describing more the scenarios and characters. It is very different to inform about an indigenous people in the Amazon to indigenous people in Alaska. And here I mention what you already said, Alice, Amanda, and Tristan, about what it means being indigenous in each territory. It is very different from territory to territory. It is related to the meaning and the connection of the indigenous people to the land. So I will leave that first part to go deeper later. For you indigenous, you can speak a little more about this.
Sitius Maasi, Sainamasi, Edilma, thank you. I'd love both Tristan and Alice's perspectives on this.
Sure, I'll take it. Yeah, and thanks for the question, Leilani. And to your point, Edilma, I mean, I think that Indigenous journalism is different than Western journalism. I mean, it's connected to our identities and our lands. It's crucial to the cultural and political resurgence of Indigenous nations. And I would really argue that it's also revolutionary in that it disrupts colonial norms and knowledge. You know, when we think of the founding documents of the United States, those documents that explicitly degrade, erase, and exclude Indigenous people, the idea that like we as Indigenous journalists are working for American democracy, I think is completely antithetical to our existence. You know, as the system of American democracy is built entirely on land, stolen land, and obtained through the genocide of Indigenous people, and built through slave labor. I think that's what makes Indigenous journalism really fundamentally different than sort of the mainstream form that I think most of us are used to. Yeah, go into a little bit deeper later as well, but I would say that's, you know, short answer is it's very different, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that one thing, and the reason that I started my podcast is because I was seeing in the news just like trauma story after trauma story, and just kind of like a focus on the disparities of our communities rather than what I know my people and my community to be. You know, I didn't. It's one thing to live through some of the difficult things that we are going through, but it's also another thing to um, always telling that story over and over again. So it, you know, there's science and there's data behind the stories that we read about ourselves and the stories that other people read about us. It affects who we are and how we view ourselves. It affects how other people view us and how they see us. And so for me, and the mission of Coffee and Quaq was to provide accurate and authentic Alaska Native representation in media. And I think that why podcasting has worked for me also is because the Inupiaq people historically didn't have written language. The way that we passed down our information was orally and through storytelling. So it was kind of a natural fit to like have a podcast, and rather than having it written down and viewed in that way. And I also think that there's this level of translation exhaustion that we experience as Indigenous journalists, always explaining who we are and where we are in the world and what that means to us. And I think that, you know, all of that time spent kind of looking back, and it just it takes away from where we are now and how we can move forward. And it's just a lack of, you know, education. People, that information is available. It's Googleable. Like you can look it up, and you know, there's books, there's media, there's magazines, there's things that other people can read about us already. And I don't want to have all of the weight as an Inupiaq woman to reiterate that whole entire story, because I want to talk about where we are today and how we can see ourselves into the future. So that's just a little bit of my experience and what I view as Western journalism, and then what I do with Coffee and Quaq.
Sainamasi for that, Alice. That's incredibly, incredibly valuable. Yeah, I think on that note, there's also a tendency for Indigenous journalists here on Turtle Island to be placed in the opinion section. That a lot of the facts that we give are taken as opinion, or that Indigenous people who report on Indigenous communities are seen as biased towards those Indigenous communities. And I think that leads to some misreported climate stories. So I'd love to just give the example of Dapple first. And Tristan, these are your words that I took from the internet, some of them. We talk about how Dapple was reported as an environmental issue, as a pipeline issue. And of course, Dapple is an environmental issue and a pipeline issue. And a climate issue. But in addition, it's also a several hundred-year-old sovereignty issue. And another unseen aspect of the climate movement in Indian country is the effects of man camps on the missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic. So I'd love some perspectives on misreported stories about environmental issues in Indigenous communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dapple was a really great example of sort of like what sort of it turned into a media circus on some level in terms of using Indigenous people as window dressing for an environmental movement. And I think as a Indigenous journalist and as a reader, like I'm not interested in sort of the commodification of Indigenous voices. Like I'm interested in real work focused on real issues that are important to Indigenous communities. And I think, as I've written before, in terms of coverage of Dapple, you know, I mean, that was a story that was almost 3 years in the making. That was something that was something that is happening right now in Indigenous communities around the country that are leading to these kind of situations. So the fact that, you know, after a 3-year story of court battles went back and forth, you know, and finally turned into the actual like events at Standing Rock is when reporters showed up, I think represents not only sort of a fascination of like modern day Indians on horseback out on the prairie fighting like, you know, a pipeline, but also really represents a massive failure in terms of the journalism industry to see Indigenous stories as important until they reach a level that is recognizable in some stereotypical way. And this, again, this is not to downplay any of the work that water protectors were doing at Standing Rock. What I'm specifically talking about is how reporters covered that, handled the situation. You know, everything from the prophecies of the black snake that just showed up in everything, which I know it's like a thing. It's a real conversation that's happening in those communities. But you know, it just it really just throws me for a loop to think how many people just kind of like seized on this like ancient Indian prophecy, and you're just like, oh my God, this is a court battle. This is not. We don't have like a special magical relationship with nature. Like this isn't just Avatar out in like, you know, like the Dakotas kind of a thing. Like we don't, you know, I don't know. There's always this mystical sort of like relationship, I think, that reporters tend to think that we have. And I mean, like I talk to my cat, but that's not like a magical relationship. Well, I mean, I guess it is, but you know, I mean, but it's not like that sort of like thing that we see in sort of like movies. But I think there's that stereotype there. And I think that plays out in a lot of environmental stories and a lot of reporters confusing anthropology for investigative reporting.
If I could continue with that, Tristan, you're made me think of, I've been listening to the music of Lauryn Hill lately, and one of her lyrics is about people want fantasy, but they need reality, which speaks to Tristan's comment of this fantastical romantic connection between Native people and the environment. What frustrated me with the No Dapple was that there was for a long time no communication about what was happening there, outside of if you have family and friends who were on social media and sharing the stories and the frustration. So I want to be clear that I feel like there was a delay, a long delay, and then all of a sudden it was an influx that then created these poverty, porn, romantical imagery of who we are. I feel like what's important to also share is not only in the storytelling, but the imageries portrayed also as a part of the story. And I remember just seeing the dichotomy of images from the people who I know who are on the front lines and really putting front and center the power structures that were really creating the oppressiveness, while as the reportings were doing different imageries of these romanticized notions of natives. And so there was a juxtaposition in terms of what was actually being portrayed imagery-wise, that those I feel get shared thousands of times on social media that continues to recreate these myths. And so I've been thinking a lot along the lines with Brian Brayboy, who's a Lumbee scholar, on the challenges of myths. And I want to give a shout out to Tristan, and we'll talk about his work with Robert Lee and the land grab piece. But the challenges with these myths, though, is that they continue to be retold until they become truth, which that is the damaging aspect when it comes to storytelling, imagery, and these myths of just this, of natives being savages, and it's this continuously erasure of the indigenous presence of today. And so when I'm thinking about stories and what is shared, I'm thinking of the imagery. I'm also thinking of the titles, because I feel like that is another thing that gets reshared. Often people are not reading the article, just sharing the title. And I know a lot of editorial parts come into play on changing titles that continuously creates what's going to get a catchy, and often they're damaging perspectives of particular people. And this is my own experience, because I'm one of those that does op-eds, and I get frustrated every time my journal editor, who's largely non-native, changes the title to portray this damaged argument that I'm not trying to do. And so I feel like there's other levels of language usage that continues, that the nuanced ways that continues to create damaging perspectives as our people.
Yes, I completely agree with this, with both of you, and this idea of like over romanticizing Indigenous peoples, fetishizing. I don't speak that that kind of language, that the sacred and all of these different things. Like, I don't. There are people that jive with that, and I think that that's great. But I also, as just me as a person, that's not what gets me going. I did a presentation one time during this this space kind of conference, because my background, actually, my education is in aerospace, and so I have this really cool idea of like long-term human space flight and cultural, my culture, heritage. So I remember they had a question, how can astronauts who are in long-term human spaceflight, how can we better support their livelihoods? And the only thing that came to my mind was that we need to be able to get people out of the space station, because you can get cabin fever. Because if you live in the Arctic, that you can't just stay in your house the whole winter. It's like, it just doesn't happen, and so like you need to create that relationship with your environment. You need to be able to be free and kind of test the waters. And I think that the Inupiaq people of the far north, we've been scientists by trial and error for thousands of years, and that's how we figured out to live in one of the harshest climates in the world. And so there's this relationship, obviously, that we have with the environment, but I don't like to over romanticize it either. Like, I'm not trying to be like hokey pokey and and I think that what I'm hearing a lot too in the Arctic is this gloom and doom, and this victim mentality of like, we're victims of climate change. And the Inupiaq people are so proud that we don't claim that victimization as Inupiaq people. Like, we've been in the Arctic for thousands of years. There's a lot of pride that we have in who we are and how we carry ourselves. So in my reporting that I've done in Utqiagvik, in my hometown, that was a huge focus point for me, because I don't want to promote and perpetuate this victim mentality that we're victims of climate change, because in all honesty, our lives have always been changing. Our environment has always been changing. Inupiaq people know this. And even with the onset of colonization, all of that, like we have always been adapting, and we always have been resilient. So I don't choose to claim this victimization. And, you know, we've been here for thousands of years. We're going to be here for thousands of years more. And that's just one thing that we focused on in our reporting. And I think that one big focus of that too was what kinds of things have changed, obviously, because things are changing, but what kinds of things have remained the same? That was an important question that we had, and we asked each person that we interviewed, because that is also super important, you know, in perspective, and to share that story with folks that, you know, maybe know nothing about living in the Arctic.
Thank you for that, Sainamasi. Yeah, I think that's really important about the rejection of the victimhood narrative. My family has been on Guahan, known as Guam, for the last 4,000 years, and it is expected that Guam will be largely underwater in the next 50 years. So we are often portrayed as climate refugees. When a common phrase across the Pacific is we're not drowning, we're fighting. Edilma, I'd love to know how these stereotypes play out in the media landscape in Colombia and South America.
It is real what Alice says. Unfortunately, the media generally re-victimize every time. In the Colombian context, we have been for more than 50 years of armed conflict, and the indigenous communities have been they have suffered violence, and the storytelling of victimization is permanent in the information we provide as journalists. So we need to change the storytelling of hope, to show beyond of what communities are living in terms of armed conflict, but also the conflicts of fight and defense of indigenous communities around the land or territory. This is permanent, so it prevails the portrait of the indigenous peoples when they are in protest, in strikes, mobilization, marches, which is criminalized by the media. And that storytelling is kept through the years. And that has harmed the history of the country and the indigenous peoples too. Additionally, there are ideas we cannot overlook, things that are happening in the country. Allow me to say this in Colombia. In the last 4 or 5 years after the signature of the peace process, more than 69 leaders, indigenous leaders, have been killed. Leaders without mentioning just community-based, without mentioning community-based indigenous, and the coordinator of the organizations that are part of the indigenous people. Last week, she mentioned that only this year, 2021, 19 leaders have been killed, indigenous leaders in the Amazon. Out of those 19 indigenous leaders, most of them, 12 are part of Colombia. So we have stronger realities, and journalists respect of what's going on within the communities. You said that romanticizing the indigenous people who are in the reality is to understand a little more what's going on in the territory. Criminal groups, narco traffic, illegal mining, legal mining too, many realities, deforestation that is illegal. We journalists should narrate, understand, approach more the indigenous people, not to re-victimize, and insight beyond the victims and numbers within the indigenous people. There are a lot of marvelous fights to recover. For example, the language that is being lost marvelous stories adapting to the climate change, as Alice is mentioning. So those initiatives of memory, those initiatives of peace, community initiatives are the ones that journalists, we must start building hand in hand with communities. And I agree with Tristan when he says indigenous journalism that you do inside is different than the journalism we do from outside. But the one we do outside, we can do it better. We can balance it, build it collaboratively with you so that precisely uh, with these two views, we can be more respectful with our journalism than what is being done historically.
Thank you, Edilma. And you brought up something very important, which is the targeting of what's called land defenders. It's a huge problem across, well, the US, South America. It's a huge problem in the Philippines. You also talked about the media's role in reinforcing these stereotypes specifically tied to criminalization of protests. That is something that also occurred here during DAPL. There was a mercenary and security firm known as Tiger Swan that was protecting DAPL, and internal communications were leaked by the Intercept. And Tiger Swan described the movement as an ideologically driven insurgency with a strong religious component, and compared Indigenous water protectors to jihadist fighters, modeled after the jihadist insurgency model. So there are serious consequences for these stereotypes, is what I'm getting at. And I'd love for a little bit more discussion about the effects of these stereotypes themselves on Indigenous communities. And I'd really like to start with Amanda.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're all saying, and what I probably would say in 2 points, takeaways, is that these stereotypes diminish Indigenous sovereignty, that we are self-determined and governed people with the right to protect and care for the land and our future generations. I mean, that's it. And the other thing is it actually diminishes these larger issues of structures of settler colonialism, racism, and white supremacy, which I frame as systemic monsters that continue to thrive and maintain dominance and power over the land and the peoples of this place. And so when we're doing stories then, or when you were telling journalistic thinking, it's like, do we know the history of what's happening? Not only the context is important for sure, but what about the centuries old history that has been mythicized into damaging ways that we think about people? And so these stereotypes, there's research that has been done by Tulalip scholar Stephanie Freiberg, who's actually done some really amazing research that looks at how negative, like stereotypes, actually impacts the well-being of Native children. And so she did some really great work on where she gave Native children, they looked at pictures of racist mascots, Pocahontas, which gets to the fantasy romance notion, and found that Native students' motivation decreased upon these imagery. And she has continuously done research with many peoples that just continues to affirm the damaging ways that these imagery has on people's psychological well-being. And it also diminishes a possible self. So it continuously erases the ways in which Indigenous people see themselves and see how they can be future selves. And so these stereotypes continue to erase that, which is really connected to these larger white supremacist notions of let's erase the Indigenous peoples so we can empower and rule over the land. And which is connected to how these stereotypes are infiltrated, just roots old, generations old. I wanted to also mention that there's been some wonderful research by Reclaiming Native Truth with wonderful scholars who are actually investigating. You can go on their website and and looking at the general public's opinions of Indigenous peoples, and they're finding what many of us Native people know to be true. Largely, the general public sees us as obsolete, that we're no longer here, which speaks to this problematic issue of erasure and the continuation of stereotypes. I also want to give a shout out to, again, Dr. Brian Brayboy and Jeremiah Chen, who've also doing some work called Territory, which is the simultaneously erasing of Indigenous presence while creating a imagery of romanticized notions. So it's this paradox of that happening at the same time. So there's wonderful people who are doing some of this work and exposing the damaging ways that these stereotypes have on our people and well-being and futures.
Tristan, can I hear from you again?
Yeah, I mean, I can't add anything necessarily in terms of the impact of stereotypes that other folks haven't already said, but I would again put this back on journalists who are engaged in this work. Again, this idea that that the profession is so embedded in American culture that it just thinks of itself as an unofficial branch of government. Like this idea of the fourth estate, which that typically means is that if you are working for an outlet that says we are working for democracy, or maybe democracy dies in darkness, however you're going to frame that sort of phrase, it means that you're working in tandem with US imperial power here. We talk about being hopelessly tied to the state with our work, and that is not what journalists, I believe, should be doing. We should not be beholden to the state. We should be beholden to our audiences. I mean, and I think that's a really straightforward idea. So when we're talking about we support democracy, that's, democracy that we're generally talking about in the US is really more akin to styles of US imperialism. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about even land back movement and stuff like that. But when we're thinking about the relationship that journalists have with state power and pinging that off to think about how we're covering Indigenous communities, those things don't compute. And I think that's where a lot of those stereotypes tend to sort of find root and sprout.
Edilma, Alice, anything to add on that?
Yeah, so when I think about stereotypes, I did this episode titled Eskimo versus Inuit and why language matters, and I wanted to find out if, Inupiaq people or Inuit people had a preference whether or not they viewed themselves as Eskimo or if they viewed themselves as Inupiaq, Inuit, or what have you. There are various Inuit tribes across the circumpolar north. And I think that there's this idea of that people have of Eskimos to be primitive, to be in the past, to be, not into the future, not here and now. But it bothers me because, just think of all of the ingenuity it takes to live in such a harsh climate, and some of the ideas that we can bring, not just, and I spoke about this a little bit earlier about space travel, that's just, there's so much knowledge that we have that, that we can share for the future. And it's just so cool to me. I mean, we have a water and sewer infrastructure in the Arctic, and it's it is the second most expensive utility ever made per capita. And the first one is the International Space Station. It takes a lot of sophistication to create this system of just water and sewer, just to have running water in the Arctic, right? And so there's just this idea that we're portrayed in the past as primitive, as not bringing cool ideas to the table, cool things well into the future as Eskimos, right? And so and then we figure out where even the word Eskimo came from. I don't consider myself an Eskimo because what does that mean? I know what my name Inupiaq means in my language. And I think that Eskimo is just raw meat eater. And there are some people that are yeah, I do eat raw meat, but I'm is that all you do? Are you going to define yourself as a raw meat eater, like that's not who we are. Inua, is like spirit or breath. And it just means the real people, because there's this idea, that there are varying different spiritualities and different kinds of shapeshifters and people, and Inupiaq means the real people. So I think that there's this how do we address ourselves, how other people address us, like Amanda was saying, that it has an effect on how we view ourselves and how people view us. So and I don't like to, sometimes I say Eskimo because it's just kind of in our vernacular, we say it, it happens, but I'm trying to move forward in my own life to kind of move away from that and only speak in words that I know me to be and my people to be. So in a way, that's my own little like anti-stereotypical like stance. But and it's up to each person. I don't judge any other Inupiaq or Inuit person that wants to call themselves Eskimo, but for me personally, I reject it, and I want to move forward and move away from it.
Edilma, so y'all, we are already only 10 minutes, or we've got 9 minutes only left. So we'll get to Q&A, I think. But I love Edilma's response to this question as well. Edilma, I'd love your perspective on the effects of stereotypical media in your community. Uh-oh, do we still have her?
Vale. Yo lo que abordaría mejor es,
I would say we should wonder in the independent media how we change the storytelling that historically we have established when we tell stories about the indigenous communities. So what we have done is to establish in our work some techniques maybe used by other disciplines to observe more, hear more. I believe that we journalists need to hear the communities, to see the stories in a more respectful way, not just go in with a rush of the news, because the news requires immediate timing, but communities invite us to dedicate more time to hear them, and the journalism doesn't do that much, and the agenda of journalism doesn't go from the media, but from the communities. What really the hearing of the communities, they should tell us what we should tell to approach a bit more to a respectful storytelling. We are setting open editorial agendas with indigenous leaders in Latin America and Colombia, and we are asking what we should cover, which are the stories that are missing in the public agenda in the traditional media. And here I'd like to appreciate Pulitzer, because precisely these agendas, these topics out of these discussions are supported by the organizations like Pulitzer that allows us to do that. It is difficult, big media, to support this kind of freelance, these stories. It is difficult to be approved by the big media. It requires other timing, other narrative, other storytelling from the communities. So to create this agenda with hearing the communities will allow us to do different journalism. And these stories we produce, like Agenda Propia, independent media, reach the national public agenda. That is a challenge. We who cover indigenous media, we are also pointed at, because somehow we they try to say that we do not do journalism. So within the guild, we should fight internally our own fight within the system of the media, it is complex. I think we can make it if we look at the communities, if we look at the territories, if we look at the most affected indigenous people by different realities, to try to do that together, collaboration journalism that we need, and technologies allow to do that, and acknowledge, I believe that journalists, we need to acknowledge that there are people, there is diversity in the indigenous communities, and within they are ready. We don't know that there are indigenous journalists, there are indigenous movie makers, professionals, indigenous professionals. We do not know that. When the guild starts to acknowledge that there is a diversity within the very, uh, to create stories within our exercise, we will be able to be more responsible and be able to tell better what is going on within the communities, especially these issues related to the land.
Sainamasi for all of that. Um, I guess we're supposed to move into Q&A now, but I am going to throw one more question in there. Since there are a lot of questions about resources, I think that we can answer questions about resources for telling more honest stories while also mentioning perhaps some folks or some stories within our own communities that are nuanced or being told right. In my own community back in Guahan, the Pacific Daily News has been doing a lot of work on the disinterment of about 15 different grave sites by the US Marines. And that is both an environmental issue and a sovereignty issue that they are doing a very good job framing both ways. And as for resources, I'd say talk to Indigenous people. Just round robin, anybody else?
I mean, I would say go local. Oh, sorry, Amanda.
No, go ahead, Alice, please.
I mean, I would just say go local. You know, it starts with trust. You know, I think that there's a distrust right now in journalism across the board. This whole era of like hashtag fake news and stuff like that, and these like overgeneralized, oversimplified headlines. I have to question, you know, whether some of these stories are actually how they are. I have to think like, if I was there, you know, like what would I see? And so I think it's all about trust, and I think that that's probably what's missing in journalism across the board right now, is that we just don't trust the people that we're hearing our information from. So for me, I would say just, I call it the auntie network. Like I talk to all of my aunties, you know, and I kind of get the consensus from people I trust. And so go local.
I would also add, if you're not already following, there's a ton of amazing Native journalists, Native newspapers out there that you should follow. Start reading their pieces, learn the language that they use. You'll then recognize maybe Eskimo is not the right word to use, right? By how they're framing themselves. So there's the Navajo Times, there's the Indian Country Today, there's Native News Outlet, there's the Native American Journals Association, NAJA. Tristan is a wonderful writer and editor. Also, I want to put a plug out, there's a media like Media Indigena by Candice Callison from Canada. There's the Red Nation, just doing some remarkable stuff. Just dropped a book yesterday called The Red Deal that's really talking about what we're talking about from a community perspective. I want to give a shout out again to Candice Callison's book, Reckoning. If you have not read this yet, it's actually the argument, it's Reckoning, Journalism's Limits and Possibilities, written with her and Mary Lynn Young. And their argument is for journalists need to think beyond just reporting on events as one-offs, which we didn't talk about, but which is true. And think about how histories and structured systems are part of what events can reveal. So the core question of the book is, how do journalists know what they know, which is questions that some of you prompted. So how do you know what you know? How do we decide what's good journalism, and who gets to decide that? So I would definitely say read up, do your homework. There's a lot of rich knowledge out there that you could learn from. Also, I should put another plug out for Arizona State University's Turning Points magazine, written by Indigenous students, like former students Taylor Noda, who are they're just young, vibrant, smart, intelligent people writing on an array of stories. I want to put a shout out for them as well.
Yeah, there are tons of great resources. I mean, you know, Google is your friend. I've often wondered why reporters don't seem to use it for stuff. That's what it's there for. Highly encourage y'all to like check out all of these resources. I mean, I would just close out by not only echoing those resources, but also what Alice just said about trust. You know, we are in this sort of era of like, how do we gain trust again? But, you know, I think that the argument is just too little too late, because news organizations have written off communities of color for decades, if not a couple of centuries, in terms of going into communities, harvesting stories, taking them out, and often burning their sources on the way in terms of making those stories come to life. I mean, a large majority of my time when I'm reporting in Indigenous communities is apologizing for some national reporter that came in 5 to 10 years before and absolutely devastated a family or a community with their poor reporting. So the fact that now suddenly there's this question of how do we gain trust from the public? What I think the industry is really talking about is how do we gain back the trust of like working class white people? If that's the conversation that's happening, I think it really opens a window into what we need to be thinking about the future of journalism and the things that we are doing, and maybe starting to distance ourselves from a lot of sort of the mainstream or older, well-resourced news outlets that have really been a source of distrust in communities across the nation.
And I know that we're over. Edilma, could we hear briefly from you, and then I'll close out the session? Edilma, could we hear from you on good resources or good journalism on Indigenous people in Colombia?
Thank you very much. I recommend that to follow your own agenda. We are designing guides for Indigenous journalism and non-Indigenous on how to cover better these stories. Recently, we launched a small guide with 5 pieces of advice from their voice, from their feeling. They reflect on how would be the better way to tell about them. And the guide is in Spanish and English, and it will be launched in Portuguese. 5 pieces of advice from the grandparents, and one of them said they see the journalist, they extract information, and the information never goes back to the territory. So it's a profound reflection, because journalism does the story, they post the story, but they never go back to the community. That is another pending thing, that we need to give the story back to the community. The pictures, the videos talk about what the journalists published. So they believe the Indigenous will never know when they have the technology. They have irregular access, but they have access. They are connected. I feel it is a historical pending issue, and it helps grandparents, women, young people to improve these practices. So I would invite you to continue what we are building, what we are co-creating with different people, disciplines, Indigenous consultants, and non-Indigenous, to balance the ways we do journalism. Additionally, I believe, as Tristan said, We need to value how we do independent journalism. Freelance independent journalism doesn't have a big brand behind, so it is not acknowledged. It is important, the work we are doing on the communities. I would recommend these stories and also an informal space to promote our own agenda. We have a WhatsApp group, more than 200 journalism, indigenous and non-indigenous. Indigenous. Most of us speak Spanish. We are also linking Portuguese speaking journalism. And maybe in the future, I would like to have more to start the discussion if we are doing that correctly or not. I'm going to leave the links in the chat for you to register so that you know these tools I'm speaking about.
Sainama Asi, everybody. We're so thankful, and I'm particularly very thankful for all of your time, Edilma, Amanda, Tristan, and Alice. Sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for your time. And the audience, sorry for going over and for not answering so many questions. We're so thankful to all of the panelists for today's conversation. A recording will be online at pulitzercenter.org in the coming days, so feel free to share. Thank you so much to my colleagues at the Pulitzer Center, especially Naomi Andu, our producer for this session. We appreciate our audience for joining us today. And for those who are able, please remember that we are a nonprofit journalism organization, so we depend on donor support. Please donate today and become a Pulitzer Center champion at any level to gain exclusive benefits as part of our spring campaign. And please check out pulitzercenter.org/events to see additional panels and events during our Environment Redefined conference. Please stay on with us a few minutes to take a brief survey after we officially end today's session. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we hope you'll join us for the rest of today.